Okay, for some reason, it's not wanting to switch to the, there we go. Okay.
Can you hear this?
So first off,
On the screen.
is 500 years a long time? And to put that into context, I'm just going to tell a quick story. So years ago, I was sitting in a bar with some friends, and we were having a sort of a heated exchange. I was visiting with an Irishman and an Albanian. And the context of our conversation was dealt with time, history, the song Grandpa Tell Me About the Good Old Days, and a road trip that we were planning down to Yellowstone. And we were going on, and finally Rasim Babameadow, the Albanian, got up and pushed away from the table and said, "Look, guys, get over it. Basically, you're saying the same thing. In Europe, 500 miles is a long distance, and in the United States, 500 years is a long time." So keep that in mind as I sort of talk in this first part of the presentation. So in the 1500s, mountain grizzlies were abundant throughout the Bitterroot Valley here. We also had mountain bison, antelope, all the big species were, roaming the Five Valleys area, along with our Native American tribes. At that time, about 1,500 grizzly bears in North America was the estimate. So think about this, the Vikings sailed to America, called it Vinland, and arrived about 1000 AD. After they left, 492 years passed. And then Christopher Columbus arrived in America in 1492. Native Americans have lived with grizzly bears for thousands of generations. With the arrival of Europeans, things really changed dramatically in 521 years. And kind of explain that, I'm going to just look at grizzlies. So you'll see off to the right, the range of grizzlies historically is the kind of the green, and then the gold represents where they are today. So 521 years is approximately 19 human generations and roughly 48 grizzly generations. And that's based on a time span of 21 years for humans and 48 or 10 years for grizzlies. But if you think about these old timers, these folks that lived to 110 and 120, it's like, that's five old fellas or five old gals going back in time. And so in my mind, 500 years is a very short time. So, Spanish settlement and influence occurred rapidly after 1492 when Christopher landed. 50 years after that, the French arrived, Quebec, Louisiana. And 50 years after that, 1607, the first pilgrims settled in North America. After 1600, a heck of a lot happened in the next 421 years up to our present date. So first, Spain, the Spaniards, the conquistadors and the settlers spread north into the Rockies, California. And by 1519, horses were spreading. And most of the tribes were on horseback really by 1630. And through the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, the Spaniards encountered a lot of grizzlies. and they killed a lot of grizzlies. I'm sure you've all seen, you know, the paintings of the grizzly bear bullfights. But besides that, you know, they're on their rancheros, they were, you know, killing grizzlies, hunting grizzlies for meat, fat, hide. After 1600, the French traders and voyageurs, boy, they went deep in, they were already deep into interior America. And they were very busy through the 1700s. There was French influence throughout, you know, the central portions of the United States. The British established the Hudson Bay Company in 1670, and with the Treaty of Utrecht, the Hudson Bay Company really started trading south into the headwaters of what's called Rupert's Land, and that's all the tributaries that flow into Hudson Bay. By 1700, they'd made, you know, inroads upstream, and by then Hudson Bay Company trappers and fur traders were encountering and killing grizzly bears and trading for pelts. The Northwest Fur Company started in 1779, and then the Russian-American Fur Company kicked into gear 1799, and, you know, more grizzlies were killed for their pelts. United States came onto the scene after independence. We started our own fur company, and in 1776, and then after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the Lewis and Clark expedition, things really came to play. You know, that was sort of the beginning of the era of the mountain man and the free trapper. So the Hudson Bay Company, it'll be 1670 and 1847. 1847 was sort of when the fur industry crashed. Hudson Bay Company was still active and is still active today. But in 1810, trader, explorer, you know, David Thompson and his associates were, you know, in the Montana area, Idaho area, setting up trading posts in the Flathead, Clark Fork, Kootenai tributaries. And there were company trappers, French trappers, local tribesmen, you know, trapping for fur and taking grizzlies. And in his notes, he says the pelts of many bear, you know, were traded with the Bitterroot Indian tribes, and a bear skin was worth 5 beaver pelts. So, you know, about that same time is when Lewis and Clark, you know, came into the West, 1804 and 1806. And, you know, their encounters with grizzly are well documented. They killed 43 grizzlies, you know, on that expedition. And when they were going over the Lolo Trail east and west, they killed 16 grizzlies for meat. So for 50 years, you know, the Western trade was really booming. And then, of course, like I said, it crashed, you know, about 1847. And during that time, boy, there were a lot of grizzlies killed for meat, fur. And, you know, it was during this era, you know, that Hugh Glass and Jedediah Smith were mauled. Across the West, there were 6 known mountain men that died in grizzly confrontations. But it was also the time that Alexander Ross and his big trapping company, you know, I think it was close to 50 or 60 trappers, came down through the Bitterroot Valley and set up shop at Ross's Hole, where Sula is today. And then the next spring, you know, they were over in the Big Hole, and boy, they were working the Bitterroot hard, you know, and no doubt a lot of grizzly bears were killed for meat, hides. And Andrew Garcia, I don't know if you've ever read Tough Trip Through Paradise, was considered to be one of the last of the mountain men. In his book, Tough Trip Through Paradise, he describes, you know, killing a grizzly with his Nez Perce wife in 1878 in the East Fork of the Bitterroot. So after the collapse of the fur trade, Jesuits really flourished. Bitterroot Valley, was getting settled quickly. And gold was discovered in Montana. The first discovery was over there by Gold Creek in the Upper Clark Fork. But gold was also discovered in 1863 over in the Big Hole, in the Ruby River country. It brought a lot of people. And the St. Mary Mission was built in 1841 in Stevensville. And things clicked along, and pretty soon Montana was a territory in 1864, and then a state in 1889. And bear fat was pretty important. That's how everyone did their cooking, and so there were a lot of grizzly bears killed for the meat and the fat, and then robes, put on your bed, keep you warm. So it wouldn't be right, to not mention, the Native Americans. They endured great strife at this time. But just anecdotally, in 1877, when Chief Joseph and his tribe escaped from Idaho, came over the Lolo Trail, I found reference in one document where a Nez Perce woman was supposedly involved in a surprise encounter with a grizzly up there at Packer Meadows. I need to try and verify that. But, and then, shortly thereafter is when the Big Hole battle occurred in the Wisdom River country. Another interesting little anecdote is, Lolo. What is the story behind Lolo? The story behind Grave Creek and the Grave Range. One of the theories is that the name Lolo came from a guy named Lawrence Rents. And supposedly the natives referred to him as Lulu. He was a French trapper that lived up in that Lolo Creek country with his Nez Perce wife. He was in Grave Creek, right at the bottom of Grave Creek, had a trading post there. And in 1850, he was killed by a grizzly, and he was buried down there by the mouth of Grave Creek. A pretty interesting article came out a few years ago in the Missoulian that you might want to check out, describing finding that grave site. In the upper right corner, it's mentioned, and it's written by Betsy Cohen. So the Grave Mountain Range, that's that little mountain range west of Missoula. That's how it got the name, and then Grave Creek as well. So, after Montana became a territory and then a state, boy, a lot of people started pouring into this area. And it was during this time that the Bitterroot backcountry was slowly tamed. Bounty hunting was a big thing. And there were people going back into the Bitterroot Mountains, and they were taking 25 to 40 grizzlies per year. A lot of black bears too. Basically every farm kid, every woodsman, every footloose and fancy free person was up in the mountain country, and they were trapping for pine marten in the winter, and then in the spring, fall, and summer, they were going after bears, grizzlies. And our Idaho grizzly was quite vulnerable on that side of the Bitterroots because of salmon and steelhead runs from the ocean. That was one of the main food sources. And, the best fishing sites are at these rapids and these small fall sites. And there were a lot of grizzlies trapped and shot, by folks at those fishing sites. I can't see the dates on my screen because of the Zoom buttons, but Um, I think it was 1930 something, was the last observation of a grizzly in the Bitterroots. And then Bud Moore in his book, The Locksaw Story, talks about seeing tracks on the trail. I think it was 46, but like I said, I can't.
It says 1932 was the last observation and Bud Moore was 46, so you got it right.
Okay, thank you. So gold, settlement, statehood, the livestock industry was really booming here in Montana and in the Bitterroot. And predator control was, a big passion. And by 1922, the grizzlies were gone from California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Oregon. And Mexico's last grizzly was killed in 55. Sheep were a big thing in the Bitterroot, and the Bitterroot and the sheep industry, just thrived between the 1890s to the 1950s. There were sheep all over the high country, deep up into the Bitterroot Mountains and all those basins. And then the Bitterroot Stockway, I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. You can still see it on Google Earth. It went over all the mountain ranges, Graves Creek and the Bitterroots down over into the Idaho side. You can still see traces of it. But boy, they brought, thousands and thousands of sheep up over the Bitterroot Stockway via Lolo Creek. And livestock associations, all over Montana put bounties on top of state bounties. So that was a good way to make some money. And basically, every sheep herder, every range rider, every cowboy, had a gun and a bag of poison. And, strychnine was just used heavily from the 1860s to the 1930s. I mean, they were lacing any carcasses they could find with poison. And then 1080, came out in the 1940s. And again, I can't see below, but there was a rancher documented down in the Victor area. I can't remember his name just offhand, but without seeing it. But he was famous for his grizzly encounters. He killed his first grizzly in 1877, actually over just a couple of years after the Big Hole battle over in the Wise River country. And then when he was in the Bitterroot, he killed, 10 more grizzlies in 25 years. So the last Bitterroot grizzly was shot in 1932. And then the next closest bear harvested legally actually was in 1960 over in that 9-mile reservation divide country. Grizzly bears were listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1975, but there still was sort of limited hunting in the Bob Marshall and Scapegoat wildernesses until 1991. But by 1975, we had pretty low grizzly population. So grizzly bears today, 2021. So, since 1975, grizzly bears have been protected under the Endangered Species Act. And since that time, 46 years have passed. That's approximately 2 generations and 5 bear generations, unless you're an old timer. And during that time, grizzlies have returned to the Bitterroot ecosystem. But think about 46 years. As a bird flies between Lolo and Ovando, it's 46 miles. Driving that distance would take us an hour. Walking that distance would take us 2 long days if we were young and tough. But how long do you think it would take for a grizzly bear to go 46 miles? So grizzly bears, are definitely recolonizing. They're coming out of the Northern Continental Divide, Cabinet Yaak, Selkirk, and Yellowstone ecosystem recovery areas. And some of those bears are making it to the Bitterroot ecosystem. So I'm going to now talk to you about some of those bears and where they're showing up. So this is a map showing the, recovery areas in Montana. Up in the upper right corner, the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem is where I am doing most of my work. On the south end of the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem is the Blackfoot Valley, the Clearwater Valley, communities of Sealy, Ovando, Lincoln, Hillsville. And anymore, we're getting a lot of grizzlies in there. That red line indicates where we have females with young reproducing. On the left side, you'll see the Selkirk and Cabinet Yak ecosystems. Those dots represent public sightings over time. So you can see they're starting to go way south of Highway 2. And then off to the far right, you have the Yellowstone ecosystem. So we've also got a few bears, moving north and west out of the Yellowstone country. And probably some of those bears are making it into the Bitterroot ecosystem. So like I said, I spend most of my time working up in the Blackfoot and the Clearwater. And I thought I'd show you, 4 of our bears. We've captured and radio collared a lot of bears up in the Blackfoot. But in the upper left, you'll see Finn. This is an adult female or a GPS collar. You can see she was fairly localized. She had a lot of cubs and, she wasn't a traveler. She spent most of her time right around the foothills, north and east of Clearwater Junction and then up around Sealy Lake. Over to the right, you got Dan. He was an adult male that we trapped in the Ovando area. And when we captured him, he already had an ear tag and we looked it up. Turned out he had been captured up by Augusta as a yearling. That was like 4 or 5 years earlier. And he had showed up down in the Ovando country all on his own, set up. We had him collared and you can kind of see, again, he stuck pretty close to the headwaters of the Blackfoot Valley. The star to the south is Helmville. The star in the middle is Ovando. And then we had a couple other bears that did some traveling. And the one in the lower left-hand corner we called Walking Bear. Caught him around Lincoln. And he was pretty localized, right around that, Lincoln area, the very headwaters, the Blackfoot. But he craves corn. And he makes these huge forays across the foothills, north of Ovando, up and over the Swan Clearwater Divide and over the Mission Mountains and ends up in that Ronan and St. Ignatius country where he gorges on corn in the cornfields in and around the Shock Dairy. And we actually collared him again 2 years ago, and he made a similar trip. And then on the right, we have a little subadult male grizzly called Stone that we slapped a GPS collar on. And you can see he really traveled. He had itchy feet. So you can see the 2 stars in the upper left-hand corner. That's Ovando and Helmville. But boy, he made it way down there by Marysville and Elliston. He was a traveler. He was a traveler. So this last fall, we had a grizzly show up in the North Hills of Missoula. Picture of it in the left-hand corner there. Sadly, that bear did hit a chicken coop. And then throughout the rest of the fall, right up into December, I was getting phone calls from people stumbling across grizzly tracks all over the North Hills and even up there in the Rattlesnake Recreation area. North of Missoula, kind of up around Evero Hill, that big adult male left, he was captured in a wolf trap. What a story there. Stacy Corville, the tribal bear manager, and Ted North were able to dart him and release him. And then another bear kind of over in that Arlee area, kind of in the very head of Valley Creek, underneath He Wolf and She Wolf. This last summer in the 9 Mile area, guy had a game cam set up in April in lower 9 Mile. Got that picture of that big adult male grizzly to the left. And then another fellow had a game cam set up on the reservation side, got a picture of this other big male bathing in a horse trough. That's actually a video, quite a fun one to look at. And then we had a big set of male grizzly tracks sort of discovered there by Joe's Smoke Ring. Starting to get some female grizzly activity in the 9 Mile area. This last summer, I had 3 or 4 different reports of what I think was the same female. You can see her movements in green. But in the 9 Mile, I've had quite a few reports of female grizzly activity. And you can see in the lower left-hand corner that photo of a female with cubs of the year. That was taken up in the upper 9 Mile. And we've had a lot of other grizzly activity in the past in the 9 Mile. That male in the upper left-hand corner was the famous 9 Mile grizzly. Sadly, he got started on garbage and the mushroom picking camps, and then started hitting places, and we ended up having to remove him. But as you can see, we've had a couple of reports of tracks on the south side of I-90. When we were monitoring and following the 9 Mile grizzly in 2001, a couple times he disappeared for a week or so. And I'm pretty sure he spent some time down around Kelly Island and south in Petty Creek, but I wasn't able to prove it at that time. In the Rattlesnake Wilderness, you know, around just north of Missoula, they're starting to get quite a bit of grizzly activity as well. We have this photograph of a female with 2 cubs in a wallow, 2009 on the left side. Then that big fellow on the right side, the picture was taken by the Wolverine hair snagging cruise in lower Gold Creek. And then you can see that gray big male in the upper right-hand corner. You can tell he's just ancient. And all those blue dots on the map are from a subadult grizzly we captured on the north side of the Rattlesnake Wilderness in 2011. He actually denned just right on the edge of the Rattlesnake Wilderness. But you can see he spent a lot of time up there in the 9 Pipes, some time up in the Mission Mountains to the north, some time around St. Ignatius, but quite a bit of time in the Rattlesnake Wilderness north of Missoula. Just outside of Bonner, up the Blackfoot, we're starting to, you know, get some more bear activity. That picture, 2018 of that little subadult grizzly was just right down at the very bottom of Twin Creek, where it hits Highway 200. Then we had a grizzly shot up Johnson Creek. Johnson Creek is just up or right across the river from the old Blackfoot Tavern, just a couple miles upstream from Bonner. This was an interesting grizzly. He's now dead. He was killed in the Swan Valley mistaken ID in 2018, but in 2005, he wore a GPS collar. He was captured by Stacy Corville on the Flathead Indian Reservation, and Stacy thought he was a pretty boring bear because every time he listened for the bear or flew for the bear, he was always up there in the Mission Mountains. And when his collar dropped, they discovered that he actually made quite a little foray to the south. He came down out of the Mission Mountains through the middle of the Potomac Valley and spent the month of May on the Clark Fork face, just above Interstate 90, kind of between Clinton and Bearmouth, and that Baldy Mountain area. And no doubt he was courting a female. And then you can see he spent some time up around the Paws Up, Clearwater Junction area. And then, he went back north and dropped his collar. Everyone was dumbfounded when they saw the movements he made. This is a big male grizzly that was photographed in the Garnet Range, just kind of north and east of Clinton, starting to get more and more activity in the Garnets. Some female activity as well. So Interstate 90, it's quite a barrier. I mean, I don't think I would want to try to cross Interstate 90, on foot. But we are getting a few grizzly bears that are squeaking across. We have not had a roadkill yet, but boy, I couldn't tell you how many black bears I've picked up dead on Interstate 90. So this is a bear that showed up in the Clinton Tura area. I just got a ton of reports about a bear that everyone thought was a grizzly, and I was skeptical until, one day this fella got some great photos just right in Tura of this bear. Turned out he was getting fed by an old gal that was dumping out heaps of corn for elk and deer and stuff. And I'm pretty sure this was a bear known as Scar Hip that we caught later that May up in Sealy. The scar that he had on his hip was quite distinguishable. Not every bear report I get, I can verify. And this is a good example of a photo that I got, from Clinton in 2019. It's just a little bit too blurry. I couldn't verify it, but look at that silver, that light kind of reflection on the sides. And I'm pretty sure this was grizzly. And I've had other reports south of Interstate 90 that I think are grizzly, but I couldn't verify. For the first time in 2018, we did verify our very first female with young across or south of Interstate 90. This is in that Beaver Tail Hill, Rock Creek country. Probably a female from the Helmville area that ventured over the ridge lines. The Clark Fork River in the fall in this area is choked with chokecherry, hawthorn, and serviceberry. And I'm pretty sure that's why she was down in this area. It was to feed on the berries. And just so happened she was able to squeak across Interstate 90 or go under Interstate 90 at one of the bridge sites. But she was definitely on the south side of the highway for a while. This is a big grizzly from this last October down in Miller Creek, right, east of Lolo and south of Missoula at the old Walled Billet Ranch up there. You can tell, big old male. And over the years in the Sapphire Range, we've had a lot of reports. Our first verified grizzly south of Interstate 90 was in 2002. A couple tribal members had harvested 2 moose in Rock Creek, kind of over there by the hogback, and people were driving by the gut piles, and all of a sudden I started getting all these calls about a grizzly, and I was like, probably a black bear, with blonde fur. And finally I sent a fellow up there to just kind of double check, and boy, sure enough, it was a grizzly sitting on top of these 2 moose carcasses. And since that time, we've had a lot of reports of grizzlies in the Sapphire Range. Shortly after we verified that bear on the moose carcass in 2002, he did spend a little bit of time on the east side of the Bitterroot Valley, just south of Stevensville. And I actually tracked him down on a cow trail and some dirt roads and tractor roads to the east side highway. And I saw his dusty footprints going across East Side Highway into the river bottoms upstream from Stevensville. So he was really probably our first grizzly that came into the Bitterroots that we know of. 2018, is when the grizzly known as Steve I was captured at the Stevensville golf course. That was a shock for everyone. Just prior to that, I ended up getting a picture after the fact of a grizzly up in Woodchuck Creek. That's that bear in the middle on the right side. Probably Steve I, but it could be a completely different bear. In that same year, I also was visiting with a fellow named John Locke from the 9 Mile that had found a grizzly skull back in the 70s that was down around Gird Point. And he brought that skull into me wanting to know if it was a black bear or grizzly. And sure enough, it was a grizzly. So we had a grizzly down there in the 1970s. But as you can see, he took a bullet to the back of his head there. These are some grizzly tracks down by Lost Trail ski area. So we're starting to see quite a bit of grizzly activity down in the Big Hole, that Wise River country. And here's a selection of pictures and tracks that have been taken over time. That bear sort of in the middle on Trail Creek, that's this spring. And to me, that's a younger looking bear, whereas a lot of these other bears look more like older adult males. These bears are most likely probably coming from a Blackfoot down through the Sapphire Range and the Jonkel Range out of that Blackfoot country. But they could very easily be coming from the Yellowstone ecosystem. And that bear on the right where there's vehicles, that's over there by Dillon. So they're on the move, maybe from that Yellowstone country as well. So now we're going to look at some of the bear activity south of the 9 Mile. This is a grizzly that was killed in 2007 up near Lolo Pass. Black bear hunter, non-resident, thinking it was a black bear. Needless to say, the guide and outfitter were quite surprised when they found that it was a grizzly. And after getting some DNA from hair samples and tissue samples, turned out this bear actually came out of the Purcell Mountain grizzly bear lineage. This last September, this grizzly showed up right in Lolo, just upstream from town, just downstream from Mill Creek. Unmarked, definitely a male, a young bear. Sadly, he was getting into some mountain ash berries and nibbling on some bird seed in the yard too, but he only stuck around for about 3 or 4 days and then had no more reports of him. He was also photographed a couple days later at another site, very near to where he was first photographed. In 2019, we had a radio collared grizzly bear, young male, that did an amazing journey. He came out of the Cabinet Yaak Mountains. He'd been trapped up there by Wayne Caseworm, and Wayne slapped a GPS collar on him. And he made this amazing trip south. He crossed Interstate 90, kind of down there around Saltese, Haugen, between the pass and St. Regis, and then did this sort of slow foray, through the Clearwater National Forest, and ended up, down around Lolo Pass, and he was photographed at bait sites all over the place. And so all these different photographs are coming in from him. He spent a good portion of huckleberry season up there around Lolo Pass, just over the divide, from the Bitterroot Valley. So due west of Stevensville, he spent a tremendous amount of time feeding on huckleberries up there. And then when the huckleberries started to wane, he went down into lower Lolo Creek, where there was just a heavy hawthornberry crop. And he spent some time along feeding on berries. And then he just made this mad dash all the way back up to the cabinets. So here's some photographs of him when he was feeding on the huckleberries. And he also was photographed at a lot of black bear hunter bait sites. Now, there was a little bit of excitement at Lolo Hot Springs. We were working with the bar and the lodge and the campground. I had quite a few issues with black bears there. And then there was a flurry of excitement when one of the workers posted a picture of a grizzly on the Facebook page. And I was like, oh no, 927's gotten into trouble. But it actually, that photograph looked kind of familiar to one of our biologists down the Bitterroot. And he did a little internet search and found where they'd actually gleaned a photo from a different grizzly down in Hebgen Lake and used that picture. So any rumors you've heard about a grizzly being at Lolo Hot Springs, it was just black bear activity. The lower left-hand corner was a picture of a grizzly supposedly just outside of Lolo in 2019. I think that's a black bear. You can see by the hump why a person would think that would be a grizzly, but because of the posture and the angle, pretty sure that's just a black bear. Way south in Idaho, down around Whitebird, where the Whitebird battle occurred, between the Nez Perce and the military, way back in 1876, I think. A grizzly showed up there. Here's some pictures of them. They were able to get DNA samples from this bear. You can kind of see there's a line around his neck. People weren't sure what that was. If it was a neck snare, an old collar. They still don't know. But turned out this was a bear that had been captured for research in the Selkirk, on a Selkirk mountain study. And he made it all the way down there in Grangeville. And then over there by Elk City, another grizzly. This is not the same grizzly that was, in Whitebird. This is a different grizzly. Where did he come from? Did he come from the Selkirks? Did he come from the 9 Mile? Did he come from Yellowstone? Who knows? So I saved the best for last. And this is Ethel, right-hand corner. Ethel, the grizzly bear. This is a female grizzly. She's a matriarch female. And she was captured and radio collared up in the Swan Lake area in the Flathead Valley. And boy, she was a traveler. She ended up getting into some apples and was relocated to the Middle Fork of the Flathead.
Thank you. Yeah.
She kind of got a little confused and ended up over there on the Rocky Mountain front. And then next thing we knew, she was, in the Placid Lake, Seeley Lake area. And she actually denned just north of Bonner, Milltown up there on Wishart Ridge. She was traveling with a yearling at that time. And we were like, oh, she must just be a little confused, got lost. Well, she came out of the den fairly early, and she left her subadult male down south. He ended up getting shot later that spring, and she went back north, back up around Swan Lake. Well, in the fall, she came back down to the Missoula area, and she spent in 2013 a tremendous amount of time in the North Hills of Missoula. And she was also over in that Arlee, St. Ignatius area. She was mostly, going for berries, hawthorn, huckleberry, but she was liking apples too. And it started to dawn on us that maybe she wasn't lost, she was traveling. And that fall, she sort of disappeared on us. We didn't know where she went. She just sort of was there one day, right by the Y, and then she was gone. It turned out she busted west and went all the way over to Coeur d'Alene. And she denned somewhere over in the St. Joe River country in Idaho. And we didn't know that until her caller turned on in the spring of, I think it was 2014. And she was south of Interstate 90 in that St. Regis area. And she made this tremendous foray, traveling all through the North Bitterroots, and actually came down into the Graves Range, came right through the middle of Lolo, and spent some time down in the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains west of Florence. And then she went back north, crossed Interstate 90 again, went back up to the Swan Valley, went back up to Glacier, and then she went over to the Eureka Valley and dropped her collar. So just an amazing female. And these are some of her point data. You can see this is a Google Earth shot looking from the south to the north. You can see where Lolo is, Missoula is, and you can see, some of the country she traveled around the Five Valleys area. And I'm working on a second PowerPoint presentation, a little story just about Ethel. And if folks are interested in having another winter storytelling session with me, I'd be more than happy to do that presentation. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Great, thanks, Jamie. That was really fascinating. And we have a lot of questions coming up in the chat. So I'm going to start with, the bears are moving, but do we know if their numbers are increasing?
Well, you bet. Yeah, they're definitely increasing. Since 75, it's been slow, but they've come back. When I first got on with Fish and Game, and I first started spending a little bit more time in the Blackfoot in 2000, 2001, I was seeing grizzly bear family group activity. And I was telling my bosses, I was telling U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they all thought I was crazy, that there could possibly be a female grizzly with cubs, down around Ovando. Now, like just this year in that Ovando Helmville area, I haven't tabbed everything up yet, but there were at least 8 different females, all cubs or yearlings or 2-year-olds.
Wow.
Yeah, they're definitely recovering.
Okay. Some of the other questions here. Will there be an effort to provide a crossing for the bears over I-90, or is the preference to have the interstate sort of act as a barrier to contain bears? Any thoughts on?
Well, I couldn't hear all of that. Yes, there's lots of efforts going on to look at and provide wildlife passage and linkage all over the West. But it's not something that's simple. It's not something that can be done overnight.
Right.
It's not something that's cheap. So a lot of folks get all worked up and excited, and they're like, "Oh, we need to put an overpass over that. You know, let's do it next year." It's a lot more complicated than that. But there are two active efforts in the Missoula area. One of them is right there in the Lolo area. The Bitterroot Sapphire Corridor Coalition Work Group
Wow.
is just work at looking at some passage, between the Bitterroots and the Sapphires, right around the Lolo area.
Okay.
But the nearest time that there'll ever be any highway work is going to be in about 40 or 50 years. And acquire funding to kind of build any sort of crossing structures is in the millions and millions and millions and millions. So we're going to have to plan ahead.
Yeah.
But a lot of work is being done, not for grizzly bears necessarily, but for all wildlife. Highways, humanity, if you think about it, are really fracturing up the Western landscape. I always like to think of humanity as like a new glacial period, but instead of ice, it's humans.
Right. Let me see, we have some more questions here. Somebody asked, what do you mean by dropped her collar? How does that happen?
Oh,
What
so
if they're-
technology anymore, like all radio collars that we place on wildlife are connected with a canvas splice, but they also are connected with a automatic drop-off mechanism, so that on a certain date, you can have the collar just drop off. You can actually have the collar drop off when you press a button on a computer.
Okay. And do you intentionally drop collars ever, or is it usually just when it happens naturally?
So the last couple of years is when they've come out with the technology where you can plan for a drop. But in the past, you had to rely on the splices, the canvas splices rotting.
Gotcha.
And about 2 years, 3 years.
Okay. So this is an interesting question for me because I don't want to say alarmed, but I did notice a whole lot of dots around places where I recreate. We have a question about, have any grizzlies been seen around Darby and where Painted Rock State Parks is?
We've had reports that I haven't been able to verify.
Okay.
So I'm sure, grizzlies have passed through that East Fork and West Fork headwaters, not in any density, probably just big male there crisscrossing through. So yeah, we don't have a lot of grizzly bear activity. These are just individuals that happen to have traveled through the Bitterroot area. I guess kind of think of it as some guy from Transylvania that happened to have made a little trip through the Bitterroots, and it's like, hey, we just saw a Transylvanian. It's sort of at that level. There aren't a lot of bears down there, but down the road there could be. Folks are always astounded where mountain lions are. Like I get this all the time, you know, where people are like, there's mountain lions in the Bitterroot. You know? And I'm like, well, yeah, there's a lot of mountain lions in the Bitterroot. And with lions, black bears, moose, you should just always assume that they're everywhere you see elk and deer. And there are a lot of black bears down the Bitterroot. And sadly, almost all of our black bears down the Bitterroot are food conditioned to all of those thousands and thousands and thousands of garbage cans that are everywhere down there. So that should be our big worry down the road as we get more grizzlies kind of moving in. You know, we don't want them what our Bitterroot black bears are doing, where they're continually down in the valley floor looking for garbage and bird feeders.
Right, right. We have a question about a different animal. Somebody thought that they saw a wolverine in Patty Canyon. Are we seeing wolverines sort of in our neighborhood too?
Yeah, wolverines, you know, have been vulnerable to trapping, and their home ranges revolve around mountain ranges. So one wolverine, let's say female, her home range might be the entire Sapphire Mountain Range. And so she travels around and around and around the mountain range at certain elevations, you know, scavenging carcasses. And that's what she does. And so they're very vulnerable to trapping. And in the past, they have definitely been over harvested, but they've been, you know, protected, and they're doing well, coming back. I myself have hit wolverine tracks in the Bitterroots. They're doing fair. They're doing fair. Yeah, so it's not unheard of to have a wolverine in Patty Canyon, and you know, it'd be nice if that wolverine, if he wanted to, could somehow get over into the Graves Range and in over to the Bitterroot. You know, and that's where this whole concept of wildlife passage comes in.
Right. So I have a couple more questions, and then I wanted to spend a minute on our new bear with Marissa and you, our display here. But let me ask this first. One of our, the folks listening in had heard from someone that the Grizz are repopulating back out onto the high plains using the unpopulated Missouri River Valley as a conduit, so that they're sort of heading towards Bismarck, North Dakota and Pierce, South Dakota. Can you comment on that? Do you know of any evidence about it?
Yeah, you bet. So the Plains Grizzly was essentially just like our mountain grizzlies, but they got shot out pretty early. They were a bigger bear just because of the wonderful food sources out there. You know, in those big drainages, you know, they're just choke full of good berry load, buffalo berry, chokecherry, whatever. But historically, you know, like when Lewis and Clark went through there, that's where they saw most of their grizzlies. It was because of, you know, the buffalo, you know, all the buffalo that were getting drowned, all the buffalo that were keeling over from old age. You know, there was just a lot of food out there. And then when grizzly bears started to recover here in Montana, a lot of those bears on the Rocky Mountain front started essentially becoming the new Plains grizzly. And so, yeah, we've got grizzlies all over the Rocky Mountain front, following all those big river systems, you know, east of the Front Range, going way out into the prairies.
Right. Interesting. All right. So, Marissa, I'm going to ask you maybe to introduce our new exhibit here. And maybe you and Jamie can, Jamie, if you could unshare your screen, we'll have Marissa talk about our new bear here at Travelers Rest. Thanks. So if guys,
All
if
right.
you switched, just
Sorry about that.
just going to say, if you are still on speaker view, you should be seeing our park ranger, Marissa. Here she is.
All right. Hey, everybody. So for those of you who haven't been in our visitor center for a while, we have a new exhibit, and it's thanks to Jamie. There was a grizzly bear that unfortunately had to be removed from the ecosystem. And he thought it would be wonderful for us to have one here in the museum so we could use it for education. So we have a big old grizzly pelt and a skull here with a little bit of information on the Lewis and Clark encounters with grizzly bears and the way that they describe them in their journals, but as well as just kind of information on how we can try to coexist with them in the future. And, you know, like I said, I just really wanted to thank Jamie for getting that for us, and Molly and TRC for getting that for us. And if you haven't seen it yet, please feel free to come on in and take a look. It's almost from floor to our heater vents in here. You stand next to it, and you can really get a glimpse of how tall this bear would have been standing on its hind legs. So it's really interesting. And Jamie, thank you again. And if there's anything you wanted to add to that, please feel free.
Well, thank you. So that was a young male that this last April got into a winter sort of shelter area where all the calves were being kept along the Blackfoot River. And he, you know, probably couldn't help himself, stumble onto a bunch of newborn calves. He ended up killing 3 different calves over a period of time. And as a result, you know, he was removed. But it's a beautiful hide, you know, with a spring pelt in there. So I'm very glad you guys were able to acquire it. I should be getting some DNA results back on this bear from our head scientist before too long. And we might be able to get together a little family tree where we could perhaps figure out who his mother, father, great grandmother might have been. And so
Wow.
if that happens, I'll be sure to get that information to you guys, and that might be a nice addition to your exhibit.
That would be
wonderful.
Yeah, it would be really great to be able to see too how maybe, you know, connect him to one of these other bears that you've tracked, and where the family might have wandered around here. We'd love to have that. So
One of Ethel's kids.
well, that would be something. So for our audience who may not have been in the visitor center for a while, we do have both the pelt and the skull of this particular young grizzly bear on display in the visitor center. And we'd love to have you come down, as Marissa said, and take a look and get a real sense of the size. And, you know, remembering that this was a young bear, it really is a magnificent pelt and a good reminder that, you know, we're visitors in their habitat, and it's important for all of us to work together to keep ourselves safe, keep our livestock safe, but also maybe, you know, to help the bears find the best places to live as their numbers increase.
To help the bears be more like Ethel
Right.
and avoid the human population areas.
You know, I like to think of garbage, bird feeders, apple trees as money. So envision if we, instead of going to a bank, had all of our cash around our yard, you know, where we would hang all of our $20 bills on clotheslines, place our bags of gold in garbage cans alongside houses, put our dollar bills, you know, use it as wallpaper or something on the outside of our garage. You know, that's sort of, if you kind of think of garbage and bird feeders in that concept, you can sort of understand why bears, grizzlies, and black bears are constantly coming down to our property and getting into trouble and so often dying. You know, the majority of our black bears and grizzlies that are coming down to home sites are doing so to eat that lush green grass that's growing on our lawns, that's heavily watered all summer. And then apples and the natural foods that are in and around our home sites. And they can't help themselves when they figure out that bird seed is pretty darn tasty. And that in those round cans, people throw away everything on their plates, like potato salad, ribs, chicken carcasses, that kind of thing, you know, and it just, they can't help themselves. Just like we couldn't help ourselves if we were down and out trying to get a $20 bill hanging on a clothesline.
Right. A suburban smorgasbord, right?
Right on.
All right. Well, Jamie, thank you again so much. We're past our time, and I think we've had a lot of folks say in the chat that they'd love to hear more when you are ready to present on Ethel. So we will be in touch and maybe hear a little bit more of that story, and especially if we get that DNA and find out that our bear here is related, that would be something remarkable.
Just so you know, I've been working with the MPG Ranch on an interactive Google road trip using Ethel's GPS data.
Wow.
And that'll be part of the next presentation if you're so interested. I'd be happy to come.
Excellent. Well, maybe we can even do a little bit of that one in person when we get past the pandemic and off of Zoom. Either way, we'd love to have you back, Jamie.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everybody. A couple of quick reminders. Our auction will go live on Friday evening. I put the link in the chat, but for those of you, I will also be sending out emails this week. If you can support the auction, bid on items, buy a t-shirt, or just make a donation, all of that money goes to help support programs like this, free field trips for kids, family activities, and all of our outdoor programming in the summer. So we'd really appreciate your support. We will be back here next week with Milo McLeod, who's going to be talking about archaeology on the Lolo National Forest, and that should be really interesting. And we have 2 more programs after that. And I think we're going to try to keep doing at least something monthly until we have an opportunity to gather back together here at the park. So keep a lookout in your email for schedules of events that are coming up this spring. Thanks again to everybody, and we'll see you soon.